Good morning, this is Japan Expert Insights. Today we're going to talk about espionage in Tokyo with Robert Whitening and Timothy Langley.
That's in the room knows of him. He wrote famously, "You Got to Have Wa," which is a book about Japanese baseball, and Tokyo Underworld, which is the earlier book, if I'm not mistaken, Robert.
No,
which talks about
1999. You Gotta Have Wa was 1989, and Tokyo Underworld was 1999.
But whenever you read these stories, because Robert is seeped in what's going on in Tokyo, the bars and the nightlife in Roppongi and Ginza, and how things are done, how and reading any of your stories, and particularly the latest one, Tokyo Junkie, it's almost required reading for somebody who lives in Tokyo, because the names always, these are people who are kind of household names, people who are participating in culture or society, politics, business, that sort of thing. And what's going on, the tapestry that you've woven is just, it's almost required reading, like Japanese baseball. If you don't know anything about Japanese baseball, you really are kind of outside of having a kind of meaningful conversation, or at least an icebreaker, with a lot of your Japanese friends and colleagues. So, Robert, thank you for joining the room. And the way I'd like to start this off is, let's talk about your latest book, Tokyo Junkie.
Okay.
So, has it hit the shelves yet? It's
no,
it's the shelves this month.
April 20th is the pub date, so it should be in the bookstores then.
Great. So I've already ordered mine on Kindle, and I think people can take a look at that. There are lots of interviews. If you search Robert Whitening, you'll find some interviews that have been done focused specifically on the new book, but also lots of other things. You've had such a rich experience here in Japan, and you're kind of, I don't know, you're like anybody else who might have come here in 1962 have ended up. I mean, you're just like one of us, except it was a little bit different for you. You were 19 years old rather than most of the people who have flowed into Japan after they finish college and they get a job, and then maybe they're sent here or they come to Japan. And as a consequence, you were placed in a really interesting, delicate situation as Japan was kind of exploding and preparing for the Tokyo Olympics. And also you had just an interesting job too.
Oh yeah, I was a military analyst. I was working for the CIA and the NSA in a joint project in this building at Fuchu Air Station, a windowless building surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire. And the CIA was making flights over Russia 3 times a week, high altitude, and 60,000 feet. They'd bring back these tapes with 16 channels of audio, different radars and telemetry and stuff. And it was my job to analyze it. And the idea was that if the United States had to invade Russia, and they did the same thing with China, NSA, along the coast and low altitude flights inside. The U.S. would have to know where the defense systems were. And so that was our job. It was, top secret, highly secret. I had to sign a piece of paper when I left that I wouldn't talk about it for 25 years under penalty of imprisonment at Leavenworth. But it got me in Tokyo. I'd applied to go to Berlin, so they gave me just the opposite, naturally. And I really liked it. The city was just, it was like one gigantic construction site. You'd stand down on Tsukiyobashi, one side of the street, they'd be tearing buildings down, the other side, they'd be putting them up. Construction went on 24 hours a day. If you stayed in the city, you needed earplugs and black curtains to block out the construction lights. It was just insane, but it was really a contact high. I mean, the energy of the place just sucked you in. It was great. I liked it from the very first minute I set foot in the city. I'm not a big fan of Tokyo. I don't think I would live anywhere else in Japan. Maybe Kyoto, I don't know, possibly Yokohama, but I just like the city. It's a real knockout.
And it changes constantly too. I remember, like when you first were here in '62. I mean, in preparing for the Tokyo Olympics, I mean, they had to do so much cleanup and preparation, not just for infrastructure, but also the Japanese people. I mean, there was trash on the streets. There was sometimes stray dogs that you would see.
Yes.
Old guys in T-shirts and jimbei,
Yeah.
kind of walking around in Geta. It was just so much changed as a consequence of the Tokyo Olympics.
Well, they told us we couldn't drink the water. We couldn't drink tap water in Japan. It was too dangerous. Get some disease and die. The infant mortality rate was really high. Only 25% of all the buildings in Tokyo had flush toilets. The rest, had these, scoop and disposal systems. These vacuum trucks would come around 2 or 3 times a week and suck the waste out and take it out to the caddies. It was really polluted. So polluted that there were, oxygen stations around the city. The police boxes you could get them if you really got sick. Everybody had to wear face masks, sort of like it is now. And it's just, they had no infrastructure, no highway system. They had only one 5-star hotel, which was the Imperial, and that was, falling apart. And in the span of 5 years, from the time they got the bid till the time the Olympics opened, they put up 10,000 new buildings, 8 overhead highway expressways, 5 5-star hotels, including the Hilton and the Okura and the Otani, and the monorail from Haneda into the city, and the bullet train. So it was just a remarkable, it's seemingly overnight, Tokyo changed from this, really infested swamp, third world backwater, to a high-tech megalopolis that was the site for the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice, filmed in 1966. So it was really a dramatic change. And it had just this electric effect on the population. Overnight, after they held the Olympics, they became members of the world, as one writer put it.
Yeah. I'd like to get into the espionage part of our conversation, but before I do, I have my own views on this, but why do you think, the current Olympics, they portrayed it as, we're going to do a repeat of what happened the first Olympics. We're going to lift Japan up. It's going to be a magnificent example to the whole world. And it just didn't. Do you have any insight on why they kind of missed that boat?
Well, I got the impression in the beginning that it was supposed to be going to hold the Olympics as a counterpoint to 3/11, to show the world that, Japan and Tokyo, the whole eastern coast was not a nuclear wasteland. I think that was one reason. It was Ikehara's idea when he was governor, and he tried to get the 2016 Olympics, and he failed. And then after that, it became, it kind of morphed into different things. People were trying to find a justification for it. So, then it became economic revitalization because of COVID. Now she was talking about the symbol of the triumph of the human spirit or something like that. I forget how he phrased it, but to show the world that we can't be cowed by this terrible disease. wondered why Ikehata wanted it in the first place. I didn't think Tokyo needed another Olympics, but I thought it was a good idea because the world would see that the city has changed so much, over the span of the past 20 years. It built up this whole new city center in Tokyo Bay. Odaiba and Rainbow Bridge were actually, dating back 25 years, I think. And a lot of people who haven't been to Tokyo in a long time have the impression that, the city is Tokyo Tower and the Sozenji Asakusa Kannon Temple. But it's, really much different now. There's a lot more to it. In fact, I think you stand at Tokyo Bridge, you stand on Rainbow Bridge, at sunset, you got one of the most beautiful, cityscapes in the world. Tokyo has become a completely different city over the past quarter of a century with all this new architecture that's gone up. And for that reason alone, I think having the Olympics would be a good advertisement for the city. It would really, I think, dramatically increase tourism and help the Japanese economy.
Yeah. Well, it initially was portrayed to be an Olympics based on the water, based on Tokyo Harbor, which I thought was a magnificent idea. And people like Toyota were supposed to come up with people movers, water-borne transports, new technology, that sort of thing. And it's just kind of not rolled out to be what it was initially portrayed to be. But maybe that's...
The E. coli didn't help.
Yes. But let's move on to the main topic of our conversation, something that you have a unique preview on since you've been involved in it. And since you were involved in it as a, I don't know if I can say as a kid, but you're 19, but
right.
It was an impressionable time for you. And so as a consequence, and everybody does that, you're trained to do something, and then later in your career, you kind of parlay that, and you move on to higher skill levels, but you don't start a new career by being a lawyer or a doctor if you've been trained in intelligence. So it's something that's always been a part of you, and you've been interested in it and following it. And me too, but I've never been involved in it except for my last name, and everybody thinks I'm a spy. But it's just an interesting aspect that I think a lot of people are interested in. I'd like to get into that a little bit with you.
Sure.
So can we talk about just prominent examples that you have personally experienced or witnessed or been in the same room where this kind of intelligence gathering or nefarious espionage has occurred, and maybe get into a couple of these episodes so that people know, these things did happen. There was a kidnapping. They did try and kill this guy at the Sano Hotel or the new Sano Hotel. There was this snatching of a Soviet spy. These kinds of things. Can we get into that a little bit?
Sure. I got to know about the efforts of the North Koreans to turn the Americans into drug addicts in Japan. They had this, Tachikawa had a lot of heroin dens back then, heroin supplied by the North Koreans to the Yakuza. Good large percentage of the Yakuza are Zainichi Koreans, and they have relatives in North Korea. I got to know that there's an interesting history there that dates back to the occupation for this organization called the Cannon Agency. Jack Cannon was a border patrol agent during the occupation, and he was an explosive expert. And he came to Tokyo in the end of August, the first week of September 1945, and he was fluent in German because his mother was German. He blew open the safe at the German embassy and found evidence that the Soviet spy ring was still in operation. there's some agent named Vukovic in Yokohama who's still working, and the Max Klausner and his wife were in prison. Storge had been, their famous spy had been executed by the Japanese a year earlier, and so he took it to General Willoughby, who was head of the G2 intelligence wing at G2, and Willoughby let him set up his own agency to hunt out communist spies. This was 1947-48. And they set up their operations in the Iwasaki House in Ueno Park, the Joseph Condor building, built for Mitsubishi. And they had a team of 26 members, agents. Some of them were Korean Americans from San Diego. And they had learned that the North Korean government was manufacturing heroin, pure heroin, in an effort to addict as many American soldiers in Japan as they could, so they wouldn't be able to fight in the war that was coming in the Korean Peninsula. They also were trying to sell it and raise money to donate to the Japan Communist Party. So the Korean Americans got this boat. They disguised themselves as Tokyo Yakuza and went all the way to Pyongyang and made a deal with the North Korean government to import this heroin. And so it was, a few weeks later, this fishing boat, North Korean fishing boat outside Tokyo Bay had dumped these 1 kilogram aluminum cans and flotation devices to be picked up by the agents, by the Canon agents. And they had this label, Red Lion, on it. They took it back to the warehouse in Yokohama, and they got completely stoned just by breathing it, just by repackaging the stuff. It was really powerful. And so, of course, they couldn't sell it. They just had to, store it somewhere. And after a while, the North Koreans got suspicious, and they started selling it to the Inakawakai and other gangs. And after that, their mission became one of hunting down the drug. But the interesting thing at that time was that the Japanese didn't like heroin. Americans, some of the GIs got hooked on it, but Japanese didn't like heroin because it made them too drowsy, too lethargic. So the North Koreans switched to making methamphetamine and developed a huge market, over 1 million users in the city. And, in the country, not in the city. And so that's how methamphetamine became the leading export product from North Korea, from the DPRK into Japan, and they're still selling it today. Mm-hmm. There are three items are methamphetamines, counterfeit dollars, and fake cigarettes, U.S. and European cigarettes. And they use this money to help finance the development of nuclear missiles. Mm-hmm. So that's what I know about espionage.
So the relationship between North Korea and Japan has always been pretty much colored the way you've portrayed it. They did have a ferry that ran between the port of Niigata and also Ulsan in North Korea, and it traveled back and forth. It was allowed to carry goods and products.
Is that the Busan ferry, or is it a different one?
Mangyeongbyo.
Or the Kampu ferry, excuse me.
Yes, and they outlawed it in, I think, maybe 2006.
Yes, right.
Right. So a lot of the products that were being shipped to North Korea and from North Korea into Japan too, the North Koreans were hungry for electronics and games and stuff like that. And they later discovered that many of the components in game consoles and the electronic parts had a military application or were revised to have military applications. But this ship was also suspected to be carrying contraband and people too.
Yeah.
And many people remember the kidnapping of Japanese kids on the seashores, not just kids, but adults too, and taking them.
Yokota Megumi, right?
That's right, and bringing them to North Korea to help train the North Koreans on how to be Japanese, how to speak like them, how to act like them, so that they could be dropped into Japan. And once the Mongdongbong ferry was canceled, and even before that, just amazingly enough, many of the transportations were done by North Korean submarines, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
And they would along the coast of Akita and Aomori, where there's not a whole lot of surveillance that's available.
Right.
They would come up the periscope and then surface and unload people in the rubber craft, and then come in and like James Bond, take off their wetsuits and just meld into the Japanese society in the cities and villages there.
Right. That was the Kennedy agency that was their job to seek out these. Sorry about that. Seek out these, infiltrations, and then after the occupation, they were replaced by the CIA, which was doing the same thing, as well as donating $1 million a month to the LDP to certain politicians. I've seen that DPRK has been turned a crime syndicate, one of Japan's leading crime syndicates. The government of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea has been termed in one article as even as a leading crime syndicate. They have a lot of people, half the Dainichi, the residents of Korean residents of Japan, stateless Korean residents of Japan. Mm-hmm. Belong to the Yamaguchi-gumi. And so, they deal also the officials at the embassy, DPRK embassy, are trained, to deal and to help sell these items I mentioned earlier, and help transfer and exchange the currencies. So it's quite an operation.
Well, they had a quote unquote embassy and legation that they actually closed down. It was a huge building that they kind of forced them out of. So the footprint of the North Korean political presence here in Japan is very, very small. But yeah,
officially, maybe.
Yes. Officially,
it's pretty big.
Yeah, the Zainichi that you're talking about, I mean, the pachinko industry is reportedly, almost completely dominated by, fingers of the North Korean mafia, and funneling money to Korea. The problem there is, how do you get it there? Because the restrictions are very tight on transfer of money, so you've got to figure out other ways of doing that. But they generate a whole lot of money.
Yeah. How much would you say? Any figure?
No, but so there's, from my research, the Japanese economy is about 8% of the underground economy, and that's not just yakuza and prostitution and drugs and things like that, but it is also the unaccounted for flow of commerce that if you don't have quite a handle on that, you really don't have a whole picture of the Japanese economy. But it's not much talked about, but there isn't lots of violent crime in Japan, but there is lots of crime that exists here. It's just very much kind of covered up. It's victimless crimes. It's a lot of corporate crimes, bribery and that sort of thing, but not a lot of violent crimes.
Stock manipulations. the North Koreans got so good at counterfeiting US dollars that in the early part of this century, the US Treasury had to change its currency. It had to come up with specialized paper and holographic images, change the currency because they were so good at duplicating. I don't know what it's like, but you know, the cigarettes that you buy, Marlboro cigarettes, so you can buy these at some of these the kiosks in Japan or you know, manufactured in North Korea. They're counterfeit, fake.
Yeah, my information is that the printing of U.S. dollar bills was so good because the United States gave to North Korea the machines and the paper for printing as a part of the trade deal, so that they could.
Really, when did they do that?
I think it was the reason why the counterfeits became so good, and they just cranked it out. So as long as you have the paper, the fiber paper, you can be producing those. And I think the reason why the United States gave that to North Korea was, rather than to give them money, is we'll give you the machines, the printing to do it, and it's more hidden that way. So you can,
under what administration did that happen?
I believe it was Clinton.
Clinton,
I could be wrong.
Okay, all right.
But it makes sense, right?
Yeah, it makes sense.
And so the United States thought that as long as we restrict the fiber that's in the paper, because it's not really paper, it's actually a kind of cloth material, then we can manage that. And apparently they reverse engineered the paper, and now the $100 bills are being all over Europe. They're being flooded. And so the United States had to come up with a more sophisticated way. They kind of got caught with their pants down. But that's the intel that I had.
What about the nuclear weapons materials? I was talking to Hiroki Allen, who's an expert in this field. You know Hiroki.
I wish he was on the room. Is he?
And I told him about it. I don't know if he's coming or not, but his mother just passed away, so he's got other things to worry about. Mm-hmm. He was telling me that in the 90s, the North Korea was, taking tungsten wire out of Japan and using it to produce a nuclear device, a fat man-type plutonium bomb, is what he wrote. And he said he was working on this organization that was involved in it. He said they sent the information to the Clinton government. And he said, I guess the result was they gave them a printing press, $50 dollars. And I think and besides that.
Yeah, I think that's true. They, rather than send them money, which people can always follow, right? Boatloads of money going to North Korea, just give them the printing press that has a capacity of whatever amount of money you would have normally paid them, just to shut up and not be so boisterous and not be so aggressive. Yeah,
I'm going to set up my own Yakuza gang. Maybe they'll give me a printing press too.
So, moving on, the pachinko industry and the flow of funds to North Korea. The Koreans are not the only.
Okay, one question. What is it that the police do? The police they sell, in the pachinko industry, they sell the licenses. The retired police organization has the license to sell, has the right to sell licenses to pachinko parlors that are run by North Koreans. Is that right?
Yeah, well, you know that there's it's not like a revolving door, but the relationship between the gangs and the police is very, it's very complex. Sometimes people fall out of the police agency and they go into the gangs, and sometimes the gangs fall out of being gang members, and they're always in that area, but they've washed their feet and try and be a regular kinds of people. That's always a a difficult transition. But I've always heard that the relationship between the police and the Yakuza is always very managed. So even when there's a raid, let's say, for example, they use a gun and they shoot somebody, within 24 hours, a patsy is offered, right? So somebody, one of the younger guys says, yeah, I did it. I was having beers with my friends, but I'm told that this is what I should do. And they all take care of themselves. They might spend, 10 or 15 years in jail, but they're going to be okay. Their family's going to be okay because they've taken that dive. But I think part of it is just for management purposes, they keep that relationship very fleshy and very very active. So there is a lot of goings on between those two forces.
Well, they go, it's similar, I guess, to other countries that the police and Yakuza come from similar backgrounds.
Personality types, sure.
Osaka and Tokyo, right? And so you grow up and your role model either becomes the local gang boss or the cop controlling the area.
I mean, how many other opportunities are there? I mean, there's no pride in being a SDF member, a member of the Self-Defense Forces. If you're good in sports and the girls like you and you want to continue to, I mean, what options are available for you? I'd like to move on and maybe open the room a little bit later. There are a couple of other things getting closer to where we are currently in the calendar to where we are today. You mentioned Richard Skorji as he was very active here. He's probably the most famous Soviet spy, KGB spy, and he was captured and killed in Sugamo prison, I believe. But that, I mean, there's so much written about him and what he did and how famous he was. But there were others that came in after him. The most famous of who is Levenko. He was active here in between 1975 and 1979, only 4 years. But he was also kind of eventually he became something of a double agent, and then they snatched him and brought him to the United States. The CIA publicly said, this is the greatest coup by the CIA, and snatching a KGB agent based in Tokyo who has been very active. Yeah. That was in 1979. So I was in Japan at that time, and I came to Tokyo in 1982. But even in 1982, I heard of this story and how disruptive it was for the press and for the Japanese politicians, and how the CIA was thumping their chest about this great defection. You remember?
Japanese.
Pardon me?
I said he gave up a lot of Japanese spies.
My God, guys that were in the LDP.
Yes.
Guys that were in in banking and in print media. So that he wrote his own book because he went to the United States, he defected, and he became a U.S. citizen. The Soviets were trying to kill him for a long time. One of the missions that was sent was captured, and that was revealed. And I think they kind of backed off after that. But he was probably well protected and lived in, the McLean, Virginia neighborhood.
Yeah, he was referenced in that series, The Americans. Did you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
The TV series about the embedded Russian spies in the United States. Well, did you know Aksanov, Dr. Aksanov? Well,
Sure.
Well, he was just a block from the Russian embassy, from the Soviet embassy.
Right there on the corner. Mm-hmm.
That's right. And he was, just a decent guy. Came from Harbin. He came here during the war, in World War II, and went through med school, stateless, international. But they always thought that he was a Russian spy because his, the waiting room in his international clinic was always filled with people from the Russian embassy who were sick for one thing or another. And one time, he treated this guy named Gottlieb who had broke. And so Aksanov gave him 50,000 yen to take care of his wife and kid and buy some food. And he was being, constantly surveilled by the Japanese police. And it turned out that Gottlieb was working with this Australian guy named Eric Drew, who was manufacturing counterfeit IDs to get on military bases and sell aircraft parts to the Russians. And so there was a big story in the paper about how this undercover spy ring, had been revealed, and that Aksanov was part of it, which he wasn't. But there was another occasion where he opened up a clinic in Kawasaki, and there was a radio transmitter was installed, next to the building, and it had this acrylic type writing on it. So the police thought that was a radio transmitter to convey messages to Moscow from Aksanov, and they arrested him. And he was in jail for a week. It was a big news story until a Toshiba engineer came forward and he said it was Toshiba that had put, it was an experimental radio transmitter that they put in. The writing was not acrylic. It was, some kind of engineering code. And so they had to, they released him from prison and they paid him, they gave him like $10,000 as a compensation. So Aksanov took them all to dinner. But he said they were constantly, he could hear them, the police, they tapped his phones and he could hear them talking. They were so, amateurish at doing it that he could always tell whenever they were on the phone. And there was another, this is really apropos of nothing else. I just happened to know this story. There was a guy named Tom Scully who used to work at Burson Marcella, but before that, he'd worked at Stars and Stripes during the 60s up until the early 70s. And there was the headquarters was in Hardy Barracks, and he'd always run into this Russian guy who befriended him in the bars and the punks. When the guy was taking him out, whining and dining him, introducing him to Russian girls and all this, and then the guy said, well, we're happy to, put you on salary, if you just inform us of any new developments in U.S. defenses in Japan. And so Scully turned him in to the Japanese police, and they arrested the guy and they deported him. But that's an example of what went on. I don't know if old timers might remember a place called Manos in Akasaka. Charlie Manos was an ex-army guy, intelligence, who opened up a restaurant with really good Russian food, perovsky, and a lot of painted ladies down in the second floor. And but that was an intelligence drop, and it got, according to the story I was told, it got to the point where there wasn't really that much espionage going on. And so these Army intelligence agents, plain clothes guys, who were patrolling Roppongi, looking for, some spies in action, they just got bored. So they started photographing their fellow Americans. And they got this one American guy, the member of the American Club. They caught him at a massage parlor. They took his picture and they blackmailed him. And that's how that operation came tumbling down. Anyway.
That's really interesting because the activities of the CIA and NSA and the FBI came under scrutiny in the mid-70s. You might remember there was a big congressional committee that was formed to investigate what the hell are you guys doing, and you're spying on Americans and you're having activities here in the United States, and what was this thing with John Kennedy, and just an incredibly huge special committee was set up by a member of the Senate by the name of Church. It's become known as the Church Special Select Committee.
Yes, I remember, yeah.
And that was so huge. So what happened was, and with the impact that it has on Japan is pretty noteworthy too. So throughout the summer, when they were doing these investigations about who was doing what and who had the authority and what kinds of things were you developing and for what purposes, the Church Committee forced the disclosure of assets in Japan. And this is in probably 1977 or 78. The committee hearings ended in 79. They disclosed the embedded assets that were here in Japan. And that means Americans who are working under the guise of doing something else, like working at First and Marcel or working at Bain and Company, which is a famous hiding place for these guys,
Right.
And revealed their names. And these are guys who, had kids at St. Mary's or, were prominent activators, important people in business and in the community, and their covers were blown.
Yeah, I knew one of them. Yeah.
I knew several of them. Yeah. So
well, that was also the same set of hearings that uncovered the Lockheed bribery scandal. It's the largest scandal in the history of Japan.
Yeah.
Lockheed was paid. They paid something like $12 million to ANA and the Japanese politicians, including Tanaka Kakoi.
Tanaka, right.
For them to reverse plans to buy the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and buy the Lockheed TriStar 1011. And they succeeded until the truth came out. But they were, they're delivering, millions of dollars in orange crates in the parking lot of the Okuda across the street from the U.S. Embassy residence. That was quite a story.
Quite a story.
And then there was something else, if I can remember this. Lockheed had made a payment to Kodama Yosha. He's this famous, Yakuza godfather, ultranationalist fixer, the guy who had plundered China in Shanghai during the war, and then was a war crime suspect, and then went to work for the Americans in the CIA. And he used his money to establish the Liberal Democratic Party in 1955. And he'd been paid $1.6 million. He's got these bearer's checks totaling $1.6 million from Lockheed, and he said he lost the checks. He couldn't find them. Somebody had stole them. So Lockheed gave him another $1.6 million. And then a few months later, there was this politician, Hamada Shoichi, who went to Las Vegas and lost $1.6 million at the gaming tables. And this was at this hotel that was run by the CIA guy, Mayhew, who worked for Howard Hughes. I forget the name of the hotel, and so it turned out that this was one way of circulating money back to use in political campaigns in the United States. Anyway, it's in my book, Tokyo Underworld. If anybody would care to look at it, you can see the full story.
There's one more issue I'd like to talk about before we get into just the current situation of espionage in Japan. And this is a startling story that maybe people don't know about, but they should. And it involves Kim Dae-jung in 1973. You remember that?
Yes, I know that story, yeah.
Can we talk just a little bit about that? Because that is very ballsy. And the forces that were brought to bear to turn that thing around are just amazing. So it tells you that there are people are watching, they're listening, and they're doing their best to protect, Japan from incursion and nefarious activities. But let's talk a little bit about Kim Dae-jung, he was a candidate for president of South Korea. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. And this was during the period
regime.
of martial law.
Right, the Park regime.
Right.
And he was staying at the Grand Palace Hotel, and this members of the Tosekai, which was one of the leading Tokyo crime organization at the time, made up of mostly ethnic Koreans, kidnapped him. And they tied him up, put him in the trunk of a car, drove him down to Shimonoseki, got on a boat, and headed for Seoul. And they were stopped. They had tied the guy. They tied him up and put chained anchors to his feet. And they put this prayer board, tied it to him, and he was saying his prayers because they were going to throw him overboard and kill him. And this helicopter appeared in the night, and it was Japanese Jazz Death helicopter. And apparently Habib, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, had gotten involved in it and gotten the Japanese to send the helicopter and warned these people that they were in serious trouble, that they didn't cease and desist what they were doing. And so Kim made it to Seoul alive, and he lived under house arrest for several years. Then he went to the States and taught at some Ivy League school for a while, then came back and ran for president and won. But that was amazing. This gang, it's the largest criminal gang in Tokyo at the time. And I think they had more members in Tokyo than the Sumiyoshi did, which is now the #1. But and they were, working for the CIA, or the KCIA, excuse me.
KCIA, right.
KCIA, not the CIA, Korean Central Intelligence Agency. And so they were ordered by Seoul to kidnap this guy and kill him.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, I don't think they were supposed to kill him. I think they were
going
to bring him
I
back.
mean, he was sure. Kim said he was sure he was going to be thrown overboard. Why else would they put chains on him? And they put the prayer board, tied it to his back. And, he thought he was gone.
They wanted
That's
him
what he
eliminated.
said. I mean, I wasn't there, and there's no film of what happened there.
But it is rather outrageous that he visits from South Korea. He is a opposition candidate to the martial law that was currently in effect. He was probably supported. He turned out to be a great friend of the United States.
Yes.
And I think he was supported by, the administration here and probably protected, which is why they were able to catch it just in the nick of time. And how the helicopter and how when they arrived in Busan, he was already protected. But yeah, it was also just so nip and tuck and ballsy that the South Koreans would hire this gang in Tokyo to do the dirty and to take care of the delivery of the product, and try and remain aloof and untouched by plausible deniability. We didn't know what these Japanese gangsters were doing, that sort of thing. But it all blew up, and thank God he was saved. But it does say a lot about how easy maybe it is for running intelligence and for gathering information and for getting, your enemies punished in this country.
Well, the head of that group, the head of that gang, the Toseikai, was Machi Hisayuki, who worked for the GH2 during the occupation. He worked for the G2 intelligence group. He'd worked with the Cannon Agency, which I mentioned earlier. And he'd actually met Yoshio Kodama, the ultra-nationalist we were talking about later, in the office of the GHQ. And they were both, agreed to work with the Americans and help suppress the communists. And, Kodama went on to found provide the money that founded the LDP.
The LDP, that's right.
And, Machi had this, semi-respectable business career. It's involving a lot of things, professional wrestling, and this swanky place he had in Tokyo, the TSKCC. With fancy restaurants and American diplomats and rich international oilmen coming in and out. And it was quite an operation. And I think the Korean government mistakenly assumed that the Americans would look the other way because of that history, and because of Kim's background. But, to their credit, they didn't.
Yeah, what goes around comes around. So a lot of times it is just pushed aside, but it is inescapable that the CIA was deeply involved in the creation of the LDP. A lot of people don't want to talk about that or admit it, but the story is certified. It's relevant.
Oh, it's ironclad. There's no doubt about it. There's plenty of testimony there.
Yeah. So the creation of the LDP was to stabilize and to bring democracy to Japan, and the Japanese were not in much of a position to decline it, especially when there was money behind it. So it did survive, and one can assume that the influence and the shadow has continued to be there. I mean, the United States is the largest benefactor of how Japan has turned out after the war. The number of companies, international companies here, is predominantly American, probably 30% to 35%. The Germans are very, very heavy here too. But it's interesting that the United States has 4 pieces of property here in Japan for diplomatic purposes. One is the U.S. Embassy in Akasaka, over by the Okuda Hotel. The second one is the ambassador's mansion. The third one is Mitsui Gardens, where they have the diplomats living. Several large towers where the diplomats and their kids live. It's the slice of America right there.
Right.
And the fourth one is Hardy Barracks, which a lot of people don't really recognize or understand or appreciate for what it is. And when the president or when dignitaries fly in to Tokyo in helicopters, they always land at Hardy Barracks. It's on the other side it's between Aoyamabochi and Roppongi Hills. And they have a good facility there. They have a commissary and a PX. You buy your gasoline there. And it is also the standard headquarters for the CIA operations here in town.
Well,
Not a secret.
What's the place in Hiro? I've been to a couple of receptions there, American diplomatic receptions.
That's the new Sano.
No, it's not the new Sano. It's another place. You get off the Hiro station and go back up where Azabu supermarket is, and there's a building there that's occupied by embassy.
Over by the German embassy?
I guess I've never been to the German embassy. I wouldn't know. But it's just about 5-minute walk from Hiro Station past the Azabu Market.
Well, see, that just shows the difference between me and you. I don't get those invitations, so.
Well, you have to write, best-selling book.
And congratulations on your books. I think you're really on a great wave. Finally, before we wrap this up and open up for questions, I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room that I'm sure would like to talk to you and get some insight or maybe confirmation on things that they've heard.
Right.
Currently, espionage in Tokyo is rampant. It happens all the time. It's so much of a flavor of how business is done that people really don't look that hard at it. Even the Japanese government doesn't have a counterintelligence agency. They're not that sensitive to it, it would appear. So as a result, Japan has always been, Tokyo in particular, has always been a great playground for people, even if they're not intelligence agents or they're hired by their government, they are agents of collecting information which is readily available about business designs, patents, technology, that sort of thing, because a lot of it is being generated here. And sometimes it just appears to be a business meeting, and sometimes it's a little bit more than that. So what I'd like to do is just segue into what's going on now that could be kind of characterized as espionage that goes on here in Tokyo, so that people have a flavor of what it is that's actually going on, even though they might think it's legitimate.
Well, you first.
Okay. So one of the things that is really a hot product is IP, intellectual property, that is being generated here in Japan and copied, stolen. The plans or the formulas or the recipes are somehow lifted and then taken to different places. So a lot of times, this kind of intel, it's either from a competing company or maybe even somebody who is inside the company that just is making a little bit of extra money on the side.
Mm.
One of the greatest exports that Japan has are food products, fruits and vegetables and rice that has been genetically engineered or modified through crossbreeding. You know, the shine muscat, the grapes that the Japanese produce here, they're so fabulous. And you remember in the fall and the late summer, we're eating these massive grapes. They're so great, and they don't have seeds in them. And the technology there has also been lifted and stolen. The Japanese government has addressed that by coming up with laws to prevent the export of registered seeds and grain, since the Japanese have put so much energy and investment into developing these new strands, like, for example, apples, the fabulous apples that Japan is famous for. So there's a lot of that that's going on. Maya has an example that happened within her area of experience. She's a kind of a collector of succulent plants and visits producers who have plant farms. And Maya, you can tell us about the story where the farmer, the grower, the breeder woke up. Can you relate that to us?
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, I collect succulent plants, and well, this is a little known fact in Japan, but some of the best growers, some of the best breeders of those plants are Japanese. And they've got their greenhouses there. They produce plants. One plant can reach, prices of, let's say, 10 万yen or even over that. So that person, well, those people, they're mostly senior people, and they've got their, as I said, greenhouses here and there in the countryside. So one day, one of the most, let's say, well-known of them woke up to find that his greenhouse had been broken into, and about 80% of his, let's say, collection had been stolen. So they never actually found the people who did it. They believe that probably the perpetrators were of Chinese origin, because those plants are very popular in China nowadays. They're very popular with collectors of rare plants. So it is just one of the things which are happening here, and which the general public doesn't know much about. But yes, it is happening indeed. Thank you very much, Timothy, for letting me talk about this.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. The theft there was a rather big operation. It's not somebody that has a minivan that's taking these plants. This required like a semi, a big truck, a big rig to come in the middle of the night, and it probably required 10 or 15 people to carry this out. That sort of thing happens. You might have heard of copper wiring being collected and stolen throughout the archipelago. They attributed that to once again Chinese, and the Vietnamese now are being very bold. You might have heard, since there are so many Vietnamese here, they're here on a work study or kind of the slavery visa where they come in for work training. There's been an agreement between Japan and Vietnam to help them come up in the technological field, and that's just a visa for bringing in inexpensive labor. But there's a lot of Vietnamese, and there's a lot of problems there. The number one area of petty crime in Japan these days is from the Vietnamese. But there's a lot of theft and that sort of thing that goes on. It goes on under the table. It's not completely qualified as espionage, but we haven't really defined what espionage is. But so much of it goes on for patents, for building plans, for how budgets are being expended and what companies are getting that. Robert?
Well, I have no experience in that field. I mean, I've had shady characters call me up and try to pass themselves off as officials from the bank where I have accounts and ask me to transfer money into a special account for them. I mean, I've had a number of calls like that. It's a kind of, ori stuggy type thing. But I understand that, it's the Yamaguchi Gumi group, which is large percentage of which are Zainichi that are behind that. I've seen the stories about the Vietnamese on the news that I don't know anything more than that. There's a lot of financial fraud that goes on, a lot of stock price manipulation.
Yep.
And that stuff just seems to go on all the time. People call me up and say, "Oh, there's great stock, it's insider trading. It's illegal, right?" But it's all, gang related, which means that it's DPRK. Maybe the Chicoms, I don't know, but I put my money on North Korea.
Yeah. Well, this sort of thing, it's not, I think, just the North Koreans or the Chinese. I was in one of the electronic shops a year ago, and I was looking at these big storage devices where terabytes can be stored. And I was overhearing some Indians, there were about 4 Indians looking at these and overhearing their conversation. And I don't mean to be pejorative against Indians. I'm just saying that this sort of thing happens because it's easy and there's not a lot of oversight sometimes, where you hire somebody and they're doing your tech work, or they're providing some kind of internet service for you, and they have access, they have keys to access what is the family jewels of the company, all data based. And they just bring in one day one of these storage devices that you can fit into a small briefcase, and you just vacuum in everything, whether you're going to use it or not, or whether you're going to sell it. I mean, that's one of the things that you do just to protect yourself and to keep some sort of leverage. But that sort of thing happens a lot, and it's largely undetected unless you go into the bigger houses, which have somebody who is watching the activities on the internet and the company intranet. But there is a lot of stuff that's going on here, and like I said, there's a lot of crime in Japan. You just don't hear about it, and a lot of it does involve the apparatus and the techniques of conducting espionage easily with your camera or with your microphones, you know, going to an interview and leaving the microphone, you know, taped under the table and then coming back to retrieve it later. That kind of thing happens quite a lot. Not very expertly done, but yeah, it happens quite a bit. And I think, you know, the Japanese are comfortable in the peaceful and regularly run society and business, that it doesn't become too much of a public issue, but it is something that does raise its head quite a bit. It's just like Maya was saying, we very rarely hear about it because it is not a topic of great interest. So with that, unless you have something else to add, Robert, I'd like to open the room.
Okay.
Great. So if you have a question or a comment, or if you'd like to ask some question related to the topic, please raise your hand. I think, Maya, you will be letting people come in as they raise their hands.
Yes, I will. Sure.
Okay. Anything that you have to add, Maya, before or as we're doing this?
It's interesting. I mean, what you said about well, the let's say stealing of information, because I remember that until about 5 or 6 years ago, well, I happened to work in an agency which sometimes, you know, works with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And when we went there for meetings and so on, everything was open. All the doors were open. You know, the papers were on the desks, and so basically, you know, everybody there so busy with their work, there was a lot of opportunity for people, you know, just as you said, to you know, copy things and probably, you know, just take pictures of papers and such things. But I think that, of course, this has changed nowadays. You know, all the doors are locked and you have really special permission to enter the ministry and every division there. But yeah, Japan is really seeing, well, or facing another challenge with the digitalization. Because it seems that while we can physically protect documentation and you know, information and intellectual property, it's still a kind of a challenge for the country, you know, and the government to protect all the information that is online. And there is a huge amount of information there, and Japan does not have that experience yet with let's say cybersecurity and well, protection anyway of private data and industrial data. So we are only going to see a few, well, probably quite a few more incidents there before things become a little bit better regulated and a little bit safer, I believe.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it much in Japanese politics this morning, but the creation and launching of the digital agency in Kasumigaseki is a pretty big deal. The Japanese are beginning to, you know, appreciate data security and integration of these various silos that are called ministries that are unto themselves. The prime minister and the cabinet office doesn't have, you know, the access to that. They have to do their own due diligence. But the digital agency is supposed to bring that all together so that, yes, if there's whining and dining that's done, you don't need to have a 3-month investigation to figure it out. You know, it will be under the prime minister's prerogative to do his own due diligence without asking anybody's permission. So it is a huge deal. And like you said, Maya, it used to be years ago when we're working for, you know, foreign companies or embassies and interacting with the various ministries. Yeah, you have access into the rooms that are actually doing the business, and the documents under the desk and on top of the tables. You can see that, and you can also see where the bucho sits and where everybody else sits, and they have a little chart as you enter the room. And just that information right there tells you an awful lot of who's sitting close and who's sitting far, and who, I mean, those kind of charts, you get it wasn't easy to take a photograph of them inconspicuously then, but now it's very easy to do. But that access now has been completely cut off, so you can't really go into the inner workings as you once could. Things are changing.
They are. Well, once again, I would like to encourage everybody who would like to join the conversation to raise their hand. I'm going to let you in. Please let us know about it.
And just because you raise your hand doesn't mean that you're affiliated with one of the intelligence agencies.
At least we're not going to say so.
Right. There's Tammy. Can you let Tammy in?
Yes, I'm trying to. She's okay. Maybe a little bit later.
Okay.
I would like to let Tim Sullivan in.
Okay.
So,
Here he
Tim,
comes.
could you please, yes, make me a moderator too, so that I can do that, and
Oh,
you don't
sorry.
have to. That's okay.
There you go. Yeah,
Thank
because
you.
I've had a couple of flashes on mine,
Right.
and I thought I had. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Good morning. A very interesting conversation.
Tim from Matami.
Tim from Matami. And I just want to tell Robert Whitening I'm a big fan. I've read all your books. I didn't even know it was coming. The new one was coming out on Kindle because I looked it up the other day. I couldn't find it. So, but listen to Timothy. It looks like I can get on the waiting list. So I definitely am going to do that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that every time I read your books, I learn something. I've been in Japan since 1977, and it's very refreshing to read a book from somebody very knowledgeable who gives me a new perspective every time I read it. Not all books are that way when I read about Japan. So I came actually as a Russian linguist at Atsugi Base, and so I was kind of in that world. And not so exciting. It was mostly dry, boring stuff. But it also means I was in Monterey for a year, close to where your place is.
Oh, yeah.
A beautiful area. I just
Defense Institute, right, or whatever it's called, the language school.
The language.
Yeah.
The language school.
the Defense Language Institute, yes.
Oh, great place.
Yeah, it was fun. I was just a young 17-year-old at the time, so I came to Japan when I was 19. So I just, you tend to dig up these really cool tidbits about historical tidbits, and I'm just curious, like, some of them I've never seen in history books before, and I wonder often, where did you get that information? And correct me if I'm wrong, because my memory might be failing me, but when I was reading Tokyo Underworld and you were writing about pachinko, and where the ball bearings came from, why the ball bearings? Where did you dig up that information? That was just so interesting.
Well, that came from Nick Sapetti when I interviewed him, because he was in that business. He was selling. He had a girlfriend, a Korean girlfriend. He was nuts about, and her father. He wanted to set her father up in pachinko business to impress her. So that's how he got into ball bearings. But it's just one of those crazy stories about him. But all this stuff, it just comes from hours and hours of research. It's just, days, months, years. It just, there for every nugget like that comes along, there are 100 that I can't use.
Yeah.
And so it's just a long, tedious, taxing process. The end result is good, but it's just a lot of hard work.
And a lot of it is just going out drinking and hearing scuttlebutt, and if you've got a bent to it, you follow those things. And that story, what you said the other night, I wonder a little bit about that, and just chasing it. And I think it's probably just a a product of just being here for so long. And those kinds of things that interest you, you tend to gravitate to and search out and learn a little bit more of. But you know, Robert,
Well, let me I'll give you an example. I knew this. Zepetti became friends with this retired policeman. He'd been friends with him for years. In fact, when he was first arrested, this was the police guy who served as an interpreter. And they'd maintained a friendship over the years. Every arrest that Zepetti had, this guy was called in to translate the interrogation. So I got to know him, and he verified all this stuff. And then there was another guy, a cop and a policeman, in Roppongi, was stationed there, who had some information on Zepetti. And then there was an editor at Bungei Shunju who gave me the entire file on the Tose Kai, which I was researching, police file, which is supposed to be secret, for 30,000 yen.
Wow.
And then you piece this stuff together, and there's some really, really good books in Japanese. The Mototsu no Showa, another history of Showa by Ushijima Hideaki, and so Tanomizu, Women's University professor. It's a great book about the underground history of Japan. And another one, there's this book called Kizu by Honda Yasuharu. It's about the life of a Ando Gumi hitman in the 50s. But, there's a lot of history to it. And so it's a cumulative process. But there's a lot of good research already done in Japanese. It's just never seen the light of day in English.
Interesting. Yeah, and then just one more tidbit that I never knew, and I think I should have known it. I wasn't aware until I read that book that the people the U.S. military sent for the occupation were, generally speaking, those who had not participated in the Pacific Theater because of, bad feelings, and they were kind of looked at as ambassadors. Do I have that right? Because that's interesting to me.
Well, people have taken issue with that characterization, but there were GIs who fought in the war who were in the first wave of occupying soldiers who came into Japan in September. But they were also the first people to leave because they fought in the war. And they were replaced by these fresh-faced, 19-year-old kids who didn't experience the war. So, by the end of 1945, early 1946, I think a lot of these guys who had fought Japan in the war and, maybe did not have very positive feelings towards the Japanese were gone. There was a story, I think I put it in Tokyo Underworld, about these two soldiers who got angry at a bartender in the Ginza. This is September, October 1945. They beat him up and they killed him. And MacArthur made sure that they were sentenced to like 10 years in prison, made an example of it. And so, people tended to behave themselves after that.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, and just my last comment, I find it interesting because my father was one of those fresh new faces that hadn't fought in the war, and he was stationed in Osaka, I think. I don't remember how long it was. Was it a year? Was it a year and a half? People who came in the service at the time?
Well, Army was 2 years. 2 years. And then they didn't have, I don't know about the Navy, maybe it was longer. Air Force hadn't been created yet.
Yeah, my dad was Army, so okay. Anyway, thank you. I love your books, and
thank you
I want to let you know I really appreciate it, and I plan to read your new book.
Okay, thank you, Tim.
Good talk.
Right.
Thanks for your comment. Can we have Tammy come up?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. And I'd like to first thank Timothy and Mario for holding such a fascinating room. And of course, the gratitude extends to Robert, who had given all his telltale stories, which was again very fascinating. And not to mention that I have already pre-ordered your book and latest book on Kindle, and I really cannot wait to get my hands on it. So my question as an ordinary, well, hopefully ordinary, innocent Japanese citizen is pretty straight and simple. So if you see or sort of detect any sort of intelligence, counterintelligence, espionage, sort of activities on the Japanese soil coming from somebody you kind of personally know or even professionally know or acquainted with, what would be the sort of a best practice? Like, should you just keep it to yourself or like walk away? So yeah, what do you think would be the best reaction to be taken?
Great question. Robert, do you have any advice on that?
It depends how serious it is. It depends on what the nature of the offense is, I guess. If it has something to do with the United States, maybe I would go to the U.S. Embassy first, or the UK, I would go to their embassy, as opposed to, I'm not sure I'd know where to go. And the Japanese, I would definitely not go to the nearest Koban police box. And then you'd have to, get the right person. Do you go to the Metropolitan Police Department? Do you go to the NPA? Or do you go to the Foreign Ministry or Ministry of Defense? Do you go to your local politician? I don't know. You'd have to research those answers. It depends on what it was.
Right.
I think if I can add some light on that, I think although you the Koban, that is probably the most natural go-to. I just saw something, I'm getting worried about it. These guys are doing something. That's probably the best place. And there is a direct connection, even if it's in the Akasaka police box, there's a direct connection there to whatever areas, the U.S. Embassy, or they have a person who's in charge of that, a desk officer. There's somebody in the Prime Minister's office. There's somebody that manages the British Embassy. So that is probably the best route to go. And Robert was trying to answer, there's no one central place here. You're kind of lost. And most people will just say, forget it. I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to pretend like I didn't see it. But it does beg the question, what is Japan's stance on these kinds of things, and who's in charge of it? And right now, I think, it's the police. Even though it doesn't involve a bicycle, sometimes they have a role to play.
Right. Okay. Like you both rightly pointed out, it all depends on the level of the suspiciousness and how serious it could be and where it's coming from as well. So yeah, you're right. But I guess being a Japanese citizen, the first port of call would be the local police.
And the police, as you know, they're very responsive, even without a bicycle. They do respond to somebody that's, crying in the next door, and you call the police and you say, I don't know what's going on, but I hear this baby crying. Can you come? And they show up within 5 minutes. They're there. So they are responsive. The Koban system is, distributed so that there can be a reaction within, I don't know what the internal regulations are, but certainly within 10 minutes, two cops on bicycles will show up to initiate contact.
That is true.
Well, I guess we've all had our different experiences, but the Koban cops that I've dealt with are, it's like they can't get a job anywhere else. They were rejected by the Yamaguchi Gumi, and nobody in the city janitorial department wanted them, so they become cops.
Funny you say that.
No, I think it's easy to throw stones at them because sometimes they're stupid, or sometimes, something happens and all of a sudden you've got 15 guys there. Sometimes they pull you over because they caught you in a trap, and so it generates an animosity towards them that is probably sometimes deserved. But, you know, I went to law school in Japan, and of the 40 guys that were in my law school class in the graduate program for law school, about 40% of them were going to law school, hopefully to pass the bar, but they wanted to become cops. So it's a career path for those kinds of guys that they don't want to do, you know, the law firm kind of thing, but they do want to be involved in politics or in enforcement or in intelligence or something like that. That's a pretty big number. And that comes from a pretty, you know, elevated audience too.
Well, yeah, if you're talking about the NPA, sure. But, you know, the Metropolitan Police Department is a different animal. In my experience, anyway, you know, maybe there's another perhaps that I don't know about, but some really sharp guys. But I you know, there's so many horror stories over the years about guy gets beat up, foreigner gets beat up and goes to the Koban and says, help, some guy just beat me up, and they wind up arresting the foreigner.
That's right. That and also, you know, roofies. Does everybody know what a roofie is? A roofie is a drink, a drug that somebody slips into your drink in a bar. And then the girl says, hi, I love you. And you say, yes, I love you too. And she says, well, let's go someplace. And before we go to the hotel, why don't we stop by Don Quixote? Up on the 6th floor, they have these bags and liquor and all of these great things that you can purchase for me. And there are so many stories of people who have been caught in that roofie thing. What a roofie does is that you don't remember what happened when you wake up the next day. But when you're on the roofie, you're just really, you're easily manipulated for some psychological reason due to the drug. And then when you wake up in the morning, you don't remember anything. And then when your credit card bill comes in, already it's 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later after the crime. The police don't do anything about it. The gang is all involved in it, and you go visit the establishment where it happened, and you know, that's looking for a fight. So that's not as prevalent right now, but it was a couple of years ago. Even the U.S. Embassy had warnings published on their webpage. You know, for American citizens, please avoid Roppongi. There's a roofie onslaught that's going on now. Many of our citizens have been attacked that way. And when you take it to the police say, look, you are in charge of your own drink. If you're not watching your drink and you went to the bathroom and you come back, you know, you're the one that invited that. So it's really, you know, the victim just continues to be the victim. It's like getting beat up and going to the cops, and you just become victim and victim again. So sometimes the best advice is, although your sensibilities tell you to do otherwise, is when you see an altercation or you see two guys and they're in a fight and there's a woman there and you're trying to help somebody, the best advice here in this country, if you're a foreigner, is just don't get involved. Yes, you become embroiled in it.
Yep, right. Another stage advice.
Well, once again, I would like to encourage everybody who would like to talk with Robert or Timothy, or, well, Timothy Langley and Timothy Sullivan and Tammy. So please raise your hand and let us know. Excellent. Okay.
Hey. Hello.
Hello, Mary. Thank you very much for coming.
Hello. Thank you, Maya, for inviting me to the room, and pleasure. I've been enjoying the conversation, Robert, you're sharing, and Timothy as well. I'm wondering, I mean, I'm involved in the film business. I wanted to get your perspective, Robert, about how has there been any good portrayals of the reality of crime and espionage in Japan in film, and what do you think of the potential of that? I come from a background of both fiction and documentary, so my interest is both in reality as well as myth making.
That's a great question.
Well, I like Black Rain, the Michael Douglas movie that was set in Osaka, Kobe. I thought that Matsuda Yusaku, did a really good job. He's the actor who played the killer, the psychopath in the movie. I thought they did a good job, of depicting what it was. Most of the movies that are made about Japanese underworld are not very good, and they have they have an inaccurate picture of what it's really like. I thought parts of that movie were good. Other parts were, off the charts, but I can't think of this one, The Outsider, that Netflix did. That was just absolutely horrible. Any movie that has an American as a hero who comes in and takes over as boss of the office is just, avoid it by all means. This is just ridiculous. Never happened.
Well, James Michener, not James Michener, James, who was it? It wasn't Black Rain with Takakura Ken?
Yeah.
That wasn't Black Rain.
Michael Douglas, Takakura Ken, but the Matsuda Yusaku played the Yakuza, and he was just outstanding.
That was a fabulous movie, and I think to Naj's question, Hollywood had a horrible experience in filming that and in shooting on location, and it created a lot of bad blood between Japan and Hollywood. And then they tried it a couple of other times. The most recent famous one was The Last Samurai, and once again Hollywood just had a horrible experience, and so there's probably a little bit of a prejudice in trying to do what Naj you're attempting to look into. But Jake Adelstein has had a book out that they're going to make into maybe a Netflix series. I'm not sure. You're good friends with Jake, Robert. Do you know much?
Yeah,
about
they're shooting it now. They're about halfway through. Michael Mann is directing it.
What's it called?
Tokyo Vice.
Oh, interesting. Michael Mann. He's the man. Yeah.
Yeah. Who is the actor that's playing Jake?
I don't remember how to pronounce his name.
Initially, it was the fellow who was in The Hobbit.
No, it was him. No, this is the guy who was the star of the movie The Fault of Our Stars and Baby Driver, the tall, blonde-haired guy, Engel something.
Oh, yes, looks very much like Jake.
Right, yes, they're doubles almost. All right, the best Yakuza movies are the ones that were made by Fukasaku.
I was going to mention that, yeah. So was that very accurate?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was perfect. It was a counterpoint to the Takakura Ken Yakuza, the Ninkyo movies, where all Yakuza were honorable. But in Fukasaku's world, none of the Yakuza were honorable. They'd sell out their mother, for, a packet full of dope. And so those are the best, by far. And then most of them they're available in English. If you can't understand the Japanese, they're called Battle Without Honor and Humanity. There's 5 of them, but they're just really outstanding.
I was really quite impressed. I've seen quite a few of those films. They're really brilliant, and they should be remade, I think.
Oh yeah, no.
But it begs the question. Typically the stories will be a hero coming from America or another country trying to, liberate or help the Japanese. Are there any heroes that are local though? Hero stories or hero characters, archetypes.
What do you mean? I don't know.
In this world, it seems like everyone's kind of like caught in a bind, and everyone's kind of like exploiting each other. It's a bit like the Fukusaku Kenji films, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It's very bleak in that sense, but are there any, people who are kind of like going against the trend, trying to, I mean, if there are liberators coming from America, surely there are liberators from domestic, amongst the Japanese themselves,
I was the Honda Yasuharu, who wrote the book Kizu, had this great line in there in which she, at the end, in which she says, I've seen all the Takakura Ken movies and all that, but he says, I don't think there is such a thing as a good Yakuza. I've never met one, and I don't think I ever will. They're basically miserable people who can't do anything else. And the ones that
How about that?
Well, the guy, Iki Susumu, the head of the Inagawa Kai, was an exception, I guess. I mean, he was the first Keizai Yakuza financial gangster in Japan in the 1980s. He was, active in the black markets, and he was in the Yakuza army that protected the Diet when they passed the extension of the security treaty.
Right.
He got into, stock and real estate. He bought a software company in Texas. He bought some land in upstate New York and hired Gary Player to design a golf course. He set up an office in Manhattan and hired Prescott Bush, the brother of George Herbert Walker Bush, as his advisor, legal advisor. This was done under he was Inagawa Kai, but this was done under the auspices of West Susho. The company was set up and somebody else was running it just to do business in the States. Prescott Bush actually came to Tokyo to meet with the head of West Susho, and they had dinner at the Chinese restaurant at the Hotel Okura. And the head of West Susho said, we think it's time that our president, meaning Ichi, the supreme head of the Inagawa Kai, and your president met each other. And Prescott Bush, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And the next day, the cops stopped him on the way to the airport. Said, do you realize who you had dinner with last night? And so he got back to the States and he, canceled his contract. He said, I'm not going to have anything more to do with you. And so West Susho sued him for $1 million in New York. I don't know whatever happened to the suit, whether he paid up or not.
But he never came back to Japan after that.
No, he didn't. And, Ishii he'd gotten involved in insider trading deal with Tokyo stock. And it was right at the peak of the bubble in 1989, and the market started to go down. And Ishii had an advisor who was this kind of astrologer, a shaman. And he asked the shaman what he should do about Tokyo stock. And the shaman said, I think you should hold on to it because it's going to pack up. And then it went all the way down to almost nothing. And he was bankrupted the gang.
But just on this theme, there are gangsters, gang members, who are groomed to be the white collar type of actuary. And these are the guys, they don't wear any tattoos. They're not supposed to, but they're hanging out with their friends that do have colorful art on their backs and that sort of thing. So this is a very healthy, vibrant industry in this country, and it's something that, it's people should know about it and just keep their eye on it. Ricky Kaminsky, I apologize because I've only realized that if I'm not a follower, I can't accept you into the room, and I just realized that your hand was up for a while, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't allow you into the room. But it's only because I wasn't following you or you weren't following me or something like that. So now with that taken care of, I think you can be allowed up as a speaker.
Just one more thing, one more point about the if you're familiar with the Olympus scandal, the two people who went to prison in that were both Nomura Securities guys. And they were connected to the mob. And they're the ones that actually served sentences. Everybody else, including Kikukawa and the other Olympus executives, got off with suspended sentences. But that's a case of, that's an example of the kind of organized crime member that Timothy is talking about. I mean, people that, you know, they don't go around displaying their tattoos, you know, and they're trained to deal in high finance to help the gang. It's all secret.
All this, I was just going to say, all this talk, it's close to home because I live in Atami, about 5 minutes away from said person.
Oh,
I don't think, yeah,
Interesting.
Prescott Bush would want to come visit me in Atami, is my guess. So,
Cool.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Well, if we have other questions, please if you have other questions, please let us know. Timothy, go ahead.
Thank you. So Ricky, I think Ricky just dropped off. I'm not sure. No, he's still here. Can you let Ricky in? Maya, I'm not being successful in letting Ricky in as a speaker.
I invited him to join. Okay, here.
There we go. Ricky, thank you very much. Thank you for being patient.
I'm all new to this this clubhouse stuff as well, and I just actually put my hand up to say hello to you, Timothy. I didn't have anything to say, so but really, really great talk, guys. Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely loved it. Great thing to do on a Sunday morning.
Thank you very much. You know, there are other people in the room who work for work in subsidiaries of other countries that sometimes are curious to Japanese business and industry and politics. And these individuals are, agents of change. They are bringing new technology, new business, new products into this country. And sometimes it's just a curious feature because everybody says, "Oh, are you an American?" No, I'm not an American. I'm a European or I'm a Canadian or something like that. But the Japanese are always very curious too about, you know, what you do for a living and how do you get your business done. And sometimes the business it's espionage, but it could be interpreted as that, you know, market competition, seeing what your competitors are doing. And most of the time when you're breaking into this market, there is already an established Japanese provider. And so coming into the market, you're either going to expand the market or you're going to eat what your competitor has already produced. And sometimes that generates the ire of course, the competitor, but also of people in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So this happened many years ago when NEC owned the computer market in Japan, and they had just crappy computers, personal computers that were not really that much personal, but all of a sudden the Americans started coming up with Dell and Apple and IBM and Compaq. And so they were eating the lunch of NEC, who wasn't very innovative and wasn't compelled to be very innovative. And then a huge war broke out in the 80s and into the 90s. That was, the Japanese government had a huge hand in kind of slamming that down and pouring cold water on the encroachment of personal computers into this market. It was a very tough battle. It took a long time. If you wanted an Apple computer, you had to go to a kit store and put it together. And then it later came that you could buy it, but you had to buy it in a Canon. So there's a lot going on that stymies trade and innovation and the import of technology into this country. It's just a natural part of doing business. I mean, business here in Japan is difficult even in good times. You've got embed competitors already who have a preferential, treatment, and getting getting parity there sometimes requires a lot more investment than the home country wants to make, and sometimes it means, you know, cutting corners and doing things that you might normally have compliance issues with. But yeah, it's rock and roll here a lot, and I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience who confront that and are attempting to deal with that. Like, for example, Naj. Naj is a filmmaker and trying to break into this market that's dominated by the Japanese. And if you want to create some kind of a shoot scene in Tokyo and getting all the registrations and the approvals, it is, you know, unless you're the Kurosawa Film Company, it's almost impossible. So you're fighting against a wall of resistance, and it really takes a certain kind of individual to fight that battle. It's a daily battle that I'm sure everybody that's in this room is involved in.
Amen.
So that brings me to back to your book, Robert, since I don't have any other people who are raising their hand. Tokyo Junkie. The thing I like so much about your book is that, like I said before, it's kind of like you are you are one of us, but in a different time and in a different space. But you represent the same kind of challenges and opportunities and drive that I think everybody who has been in Japan for any length of time also goes through. You come into Japan, you fall in love with it, you fall out of love with it, you try and figure out what you're going to do that's going to provide value. You get sick of it, you leave Japan, and then you forget about all the crap that you hated about it, and you only reflect on the things that you really loved about it, and eventually you come back. This thing, it's been repeated over and over and over again. And you kind of detail that process that you personally went through, but also adding all this insight and this interesting, these factoids, like Tim was saying about, you know, how the hell did you know this, right? Yeah. Ball bearings and pachinko. Oh my God, that's a great connection. I didn't ever thought of that. But yeah, it's such an interesting city to craft a career out of, and it's really a whole body kind of involvement.
Well, this book started with the series I did with the Japan Times, a 5-part series, 25,000 words on the 64 Olympics. They're quite detailed, and I wanted to, expand it, write about the 2020 Olympics and turn it into a book. And my agent said, in New York, said, nobody wants to read about the Olympics. His books just don't sell. And Terry McDonald at Sports Illustrated said the same thing. So I was going to give up on the idea. Then Kadokawa came along. They had published the Japanese editions of Tokyo Underworld, You Gotta Have Wa. And they asked me to turn it into a memoir, which turned out to be a really difficult task, because writing a memoir is much harder than writing an ordinary nonfiction book, because you're essentially interviewing yourself.
Me.
Yeah, and you don't know if you're asking the right questions or getting the right answers. And it's just a very time-consuming, frustrating process. And I wound up with a 175,000 word document, manuscript, which is twice the length of Tokyo Underworld, or You Gotta Have Wa, almost, and gave it to Kadokawa, and they published it as is. Which, I mean, it just it took, like 3 years to do.
Wow.
And then I cut it in half for the U.S. market and added around 20,000 words for the American reader. And so, reconstructing a life it's a very, tedious process. You got to go back and you got to say, well, what was I doing this year? You set up a timeline by the year, and then you set up a timeline by the month. But in the process of doing this, it sort of unlocks memory cells in your brain. And you start remembering things that you've completely forgotten about. That part was kind of interesting.
What's your writing process like? Where do you write? How do you do that? Do you seclude yourself in one of your chalets in Eastern Europe?
I get up at 9. Yeah, well, I have an office. I seclude myself there. I have a house my wife and I have a place in Salinas, which we spend the winter and summer, and then we have a place here in Toyosu in Tokyo. I work from 9 to 2, and every day, always writing something. I tend to go through 10 drafts, not the columns that I do. That's a fairly straightforward process. But a book, a nonfiction book, you try to gather as much information as you can. So if you're going to write 100,000 word, if your goal is to write a 100,000 word book, then you have 150,000 words or more of material, and you stick everything in that you think would be relevant. And then it's a process of editing, narrowing it down, and by the third or fourth draft, you get to something that makes sense, that has a logical flow to it. And then you go through it again, and you eliminate the redundancies and the repetitions, and add stuff as might be required. And then by the last 2 or 3 drafts is when you put the voice in. You know, a manuscript has to have a certain personality. I try to adopt this kind of semi-wise ass view, or droll sense of humor. I can't quite describe it, but it's a personality that comes out when I'm doing it. And that's what finishes the book off.
Well, that's why I said reading your stuff, it feels so like me. You know, it feels like this could be me. Although he's funnier and he's better looking, but it kind of could be, you know.
Tennessee. Yeah.
To add to that, Robert, I mean, I'm very interested in the research process behind that. I mean, you're building all this material. How do you approach that? I mean, a lot of the material before was probably from the work that you were doing, but more recently, did you have a way that you approach it? Of course, a lot of it is probably talking to people, but is there a system to it?
Well, it's a combination of researching materials. You know, you could spend a lot of time at the library. Now with the internet, there's a lot of stuff online that you can look up. It's a process of reading books and magazines. There's this place in Shibuya called the Oyasuichi Bunko, which has every periodical published since the end of the war. Lots of good stuff, you know, Shukan Bunshu, Bungei Shunju, articles on, you know, any subject you're interested in post-war. And then you interview people. And, you know, you have this, when you're doing nonfiction, you have actually this circular system where you don't know anything in the beginning, and you read as much as you can. And then you're prepared to ask questions, interview people, and you reach a point where you know more than the people that you're interviewing. Like when I did Tokyo Underworld, the first thing I did was interviewing Nick Cipetti.
That's so funny.
And as 20, he was, you know, his life story just blew my mind. And the guy was hilarious. He just said this way was the English language fractured it. But I interviewed him for 20 hours, and then I went to the Oyasuichi Bunko and learned about the history of organized crime in Japan after the war, the history of professional wrestling. I already knew the politics because I'd majored in that at Sophia University. Then I started interviewing the people that he knew, friends and enemies as well, people who hated his guts. And after I had that part of the process was finished, I went back to Zapetti again and interviewed him for another 20 hours. And, you know, it turned out that most of what he said in the beginning was true. He wasn't bullshitting. There was just some stuff he didn't remember quite accurately. But that's basically what you have to do. Every available avenue of information, if you're writing nonfiction, you have to take advantage of, you have to use it. And so by the end, you should know more than anybody that you're interviewing about the subject. You shouldn't have to interview them anymore because you already know the answers. That's a good feeling. When you reach that point, it usually takes around 4 years. And then there's a point, you know, around the third year, the end of the second year or somewhere in the third year, where you realize, hey, I've got this. I know this subject. I've got a lock on it. Then you start, you know, putting it together, putting the story and the personality, the voice together. But it's not, nonfiction is hard to do. If you're writing fiction, it's probably easier, but it's also, I don't know, it's difficult in a different sense. What is it that John Cheever said? If you're doing nonfiction, you're sailing along the coastline. You're sailing along the shore. If you're doing fiction, you're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean by yourself. I've never written fiction, so I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's apparently hard.
I was doing work in documentary, and making a real documentary film can take as long as a year, 2 years also. And I admire that patience that, I mean, if you say you take about 4 years at least to put together a book, that's something a lot of people don't appreciate, actually. I mean, you can whack it out really quickly if it's commercially driven, but it doesn't have the same level of depth substance, right? Yeah.
Well, documentaries, I understand if you do an hour-long documentary, you've got to shoot a couple of 100 hours worth of film.
Indeed, indeed.
I mean, that's a very laborious process too.
Yeah. I made a film in Tokyo many years ago, and I shot, I think, close to 150 hours of film, actually. And but it brings me to the next question. I mean, you talked about interviewing people, researching. I mean, but dealing with the Japanese people, I've been told, I mean, that normally they are either, you know, very private or even maybe more indirect or disinclined towards really opening up. What's your approach, or how's your success been with that?
Well, if you want to interview somebody you don't know, in the States, you can call people up and say, you know, I'm so-and-so, can I talk to you? And usually it works most of the time. But in Japan, you have to have an introduction. So you have to find somebody who knows the person you want to talk to, or somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows the person you want to talk to, and then you approach it that way. And you don't, you have to go in really armed with the knowledge, as much knowledge as you have, and then you can figure out whether they're, you know, being open with you as much as possible. Japanese are pretty reticent people, generally speaking. But, you know, after a while, you develop a relationship, they get to trust you. If you have a track record you can show people, then it goes easier. But normally in Japan, the first word that you hear when you want to interview somebody is no. And so you have to work hard at it, but it can be done. You just have to develop relationships and go about it in a certain way. It's the time consuming. It's the only problem.
So you, with each person, you do multiple interviews and many long hours, right?
Well, yeah, I try to interview each person twice, you know, and then after, you know, I digest what they say in the first interview and then do some research and, you know, figure out where I'm going. And there's always, you know, questions that need to be answered. So I do it a second time. it's the, I'm sorry, I'm just going to repeat myself, so I shouldn't say anymore.
But well, I'll give way to David. I think he may.
No, go ahead. Just all right. What do you?
But what about when you want them to tell? I mean, since we're talking about espionage and conspiracies and
Right.
stuff, when you want them to talk about things that they don't want to talk about,
Right.
how do you pry things out of them actually, especially with the Japanese, right? I mean,
Well, sometimes you can't. But I had lunch with Ishihara Shinpao once. I wrote a column about him in Shukan Asahi. I called him the devil in the U.S.-Japan relationship, and his office called me up. He invited me to lunch at the Hilton Hotel. Really expensive. It must have cost 300,000 yen with all the bottles of wine. He was quite impressive. Quoted Balzac and Dostoevsky, but he made me do the whole thing in Japanese. His son was there, and he told his son said something in English, and Ishihara scolded him, don't talk English. And but he asked me what I was doing, and I said I was writing a book, Tokyo Underworld, and this character Nick Zapetti. And I said he was a friend of Ricky Dozan. Ricky Dozan's a name, the wrestler, iconic wrestler, is a major part of the book. And Ishihara said, "Oh, I know Ricky Dozan. We're great friends." He said, "We were great friends. He used to come out on my yacht all the time." So I said, "Ask me anything you want. Just contact my office and I'll set something up. I know everything there is to know about Ricky Dozan." So I said, "Okay, was he a member of the Toseikai, this criminal organization?" And he was, because I had the police report, which cost me 30,000 yen to get. But and it said that he was a Saiko Komon, supreme advisor in the Toseikai, this ethnic Korean gang. I mean, it was just something that had only happened during that era. He was a national hero, wrestling hero, and he was also a member of the largest criminal gang in Tokyo. And then Ishihara's eyes narrowed. He said, "Machi?" He turned to his son. He said, "Machi." And then the guy whispered in his ear, and he said, "Oh, okay." And the lunch ended, and his office called the next day and said, "Sorry, Mr. Ishihara can't help you anymore." So he knew about Riki Dozan and the crime, but he pretended that he didn't, and he didn't want to talk about it because he didn't want to be quoted as saying that he was a friend of criminals.
Yeah, what a history! What a history Ricky Dozan. I know his daughter, who is a close friend, and a great history there. A lot of stuff going on with wrestling there. David, you want to come up?
Hi there. I too am a big fan of Robert's writing. I'm a Japan history junkie, and especially the unwritten history is the part that interests me most. And so I find things like Tokyo Underworld fascinating. And I thank you, Robert, for all the effort you put into this kind of work.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm very interested today. I mean, just so many topics you've covered. Two things that piqued my interest in particular. One, you discussed Ishii Susumu, who I think is one of the more fascinating people of recent times. You didn't get to, well, I think it's the most interesting part was his later years and finally his elimination at the point where he was about to turn what we would call state's evidence in the Sagawa Q-beam scandal. And he had to be removed very suddenly. And that scandal just evaporated. It completely disappeared as soon as the major witness disappeared. And that to me is very revealing of how the real machinery of Japan works. Being someone as important as Ishii, who when he becomes a threat to the system, suddenly has to fall ill and dealt with, and he's dealt with the way so many others are. As a Japanese friend said to me, if you ever see someone suddenly fall ill and be taken to Toranomon Byoin, where he is put in a special private ward for security purposes, of course. You just kiss that guy goodbye. You'll never hear from him again. He literally will never leave the hospital again. And it's happened over and over again with Yakuza officials, with several government officials, even with a prime minister. Once you go to Toranomon Byoin, they put you into a private ward, it's all over. I thought it was very interesting how well that scandal was swept under the carpet even before it could really get started. It ultimately brought down a government, but it could have been so much worse. And Ishii was ready to spill the beans. And they simply couldn't allow that. So I found that all fascinating. I'd love to learn more about Ishii and the activities of the Inagawa Kai. The other thing that you just touched on that I know so little about, would love to learn more about, goes way back to GHQ days. And you mentioned General Willoughby and G2. And I would love to learn more about that. I think he's a fascinating character. I read once that someone had pursued a freedom of information request at the Pentagon to get access to General Willoughby's papers. And they were told, those papers have disappeared. We can't give you any of the papers from the highest person in G2 because they don't exist.
Well, I've been told that he was in Dallas on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, along with Jack Cannon. But he was, I thought he got a bad rap. I mean, David Halberstam's book, didn't treat him very well, The Coldest Winter.
Yeah.
But, I knew, Al Shattuck, who was a member of the Cannon Agency. He stayed on in Tokyo and opened up the Latin Quarter with Ted Lewin and then the Club 80 went on. But he, he said that Willoughby was a military genius. He said it was Willoughby who planned the invasion of Incheon. Which it just runs counter to all these other historical accounts. And, they invariably say that he was, MacArthur said that Willoughby was his favorite fascist.
Yes, I love that. My pet fascist.
But the rivalry between Willoughby and Cadiz was quite intense, quite interesting.
Well, based on very little information, hard information, I find the period of the occupation to be one of the most interesting periods of any time in Japanese history, partly because so little is known about it. What really happened during those very few years, most of the interesting stuff was never written down. There is no documentation. And there must have been fascinating stories there, but the people involved are no longer with us.
Did you see the Cannon Agency story that I did in the Asia Times?
No, I didn't. I'd like to see that.
Look it up. Jack Cannon, Canon. And that story was just fascinating.
Yes, I'd like to look that up. I remember a friend of mine who also had a deep interest in these kinds of stories. Also had access to lots of Japanese companies back in the day. I remember, must have been 30 years or so ago, he was making a formal company visit to one of the Japanese construction companies. And he said he was being shown around the offices and there were lots of photographs on the wall through the company history. And he stopped and looked at one of the black and white photos. It was the then president of the company in 1946 or something, entertaining General Willoughby from GHQ. And my friend was, well, why is the head of G2 visiting a Japanese construction company? They're shaking hands and smiling and looking like best friends. There's got to be stories. And when he started asking questions around, none of the young people in the company had the faintest idea what he was talking about. And what he finally got the shot show. The shot show became very uncomfortable and changed the subject.
Hello.
I'm here.
You got a echo problem. Mike.
How are we now? No, it's
Still, you have your mic pointed towards your iPhone?
no. Hang on.
Oh, now it's okay. It seems okay.
Okay, I think that was my iPhone.
Anyway.
I just my ear battery. We need to kind of wrap this up. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, David, for your contribution and for signing in. This is such an interesting topic. I don't know, Robert, if you would entertain opening another room in a week or 2 weeks' time, because I think there's lots and lots to talk about it. It's thrilling and it's interesting and it is insightful, and it does shed more insight on how this place works and how we got to where we are right now. So I would be very interested in hosting another room like that if you're game for it.
Well, we'll see. I've got to go into the hospital for some minor surgery next week.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how things will turn out.
Well,
But
avoid
yeah.
that hospital that David was talking about.
No, not that one. I don't. At least I don't think so.
Also, you're having a book publication event at the Foreign Correspondence Club in the
Right.
very near future.
Yeah.
Is that open to people if like people here who aren't members of the Foreign Correspondence Club want to come by and meet you in person and get the book signed? Is that open to them, or do they need an invitation?
I'm not sure. I think that you can come in, but you have to call the front office and ask and make arrangements. I don't know. Call the front desk at the press club and ask them about that.
I'll look into that and then post it. Do you know when it is? Is it next week?
May
or the week after?
May 12th.
Oh, it's far away. Okay.
And
Well,
it will also be available online too, so Zoom or something.
Okay, great. Naj, you flashed a couple of times. Did you want to say something in closing?
No, I just wanted to thank Robert. I enjoyed that very much. Thank you, Robert.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
It has been a fascinating conversation, Robert. Thank you very much. You've really entertained and shed a lot of light on this topic. We have, let me see, we've got Japanese politics every week. Next week at 8 o'clock in the morning, as usual. Maya, do you have anything to throw in while we wrap this up?
Well, I would like to say thank you very much to Robert. Thank you very much to you, Timothy, and to everybody who joined. And thank you for this fascinating conversation. I mean, for me personally, I have never thought of, espionage in such a deep way, but obviously it's very ripe and it's still a big thing here. So, thank you very much indeed. So I would just like to say that it was incredibly interesting for me to learn about how much Tokyo has changed, and also I learned a new expression which is about victimless crime, and it was really interesting to see how it is how espionage or what espionage means in Japan as regards the North Korean gangs here and the organizations which run the pachinko halls and so on, and also the intellectual property. It's espionage again. So thank you very, very much indeed. And Timothy, I would like you to say just a few words in closing, and after that we can close the room for everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to remind everybody, this idea of talking about espionage came out of our weekly discussions on Japanese politics. Although the connection isn't quite direct, because there's not a lot of there is political espionage, but you don't need to be, because you don't need to be a spy to figure out what's going on. Even somebody like me can look and analyze and kind of predict what's happening, and that's not espionage. But it's more on the economic and intellectual property side where it's going on, but it is going on in business all the time. So the point here is please be engaged in listening to and figuring out what's going on in Japanese politics that might be important to you. We have a 1-hour room once a week, and ideas like this, or maybe if there is a follow-up, and we can catch Robert after his brief stint in the hospital for a follow-up with a more focused discussion, and maybe have a couple of other people, maybe somebody who is actually involved in the industry or recently retired. That would be kind of interesting, so that we can do our best to send somebody to Fort Leavenworth. But what a great dialogue, and a great, what a great collection of people who are participating in Japanese industry and culture, and all of you people. Everybody's, you're famous in your own right, and Robert kind of carves the path for all of us. Everybody has their own road, but the only reason why things are easier for us is because people like Robert cut the cloth for us and took the punches and kind of helped ease the way. So we owe you a huge debt of gratitude, Robert. And
thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. The book is on sale later this month. Please sign up for it or download it on Kindle. And I will try and pump out some information on the Foreign Correspondence Club presentation. I guess that will be maybe a lunch and a
no, it'll be
book
evening.
signing?
It'll be evening, 5:30, 6 o'clock, something like that.
It'll be dinner?
Yes.
Okay, dinner, and then you talking about the book and then being available to sign.
Yes.
Sounds great. Thank you. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up, unless anybody else would like to just toss some coins at Robert before we sign off.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
If not,
your discussion today.
Great. Thanks again,
Thank
Robert.
you, Robert. Love to talk to you again sometime. Look forward
Okay.
to hearing more from you again.
All right, sure. Sure thing. Thank you. Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Robert. Thank you,
Thank
Naj,
you.
David, Timothy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody else. Ricky, Evan. Thank you, guys. Jason signed on finally. Oh. See you.